Great. I think we'll make a start. Welcome everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's College London, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this event this evening, focused on this book, The Inequality of Wealth by Byrne, MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill and former Treasury Minister. The event is part of our Fair Society series, which we're doing in collaboration with the Fairness Foundation, who've been excellent partners, not just in this series of events, but on lots of research projects as well, which actually helped inform Liam's book in some ways. So I read the book over Christmas and very much enjoyed it. It doesn't shirk from the incredibly challenging position that we're in and how extreme wealth inequality has infected so much of society and politics. It focuses very clearly on that, but it does also say that change is possible. That this is not inevitable, and it provides some great ideas on how to do that. Unexpectedly peppy was how The Guardian described Liam's book. But you don't have to take my word for it as well. FT reviewed it as an invaluable repository of recent ideas, and even better, you can do that yourself, as we're not only going to hear from Liam, he's going to run through some of the key findings from it. You can also buy a copy for yourself at the back from the excellent Daunt Books at the end of the session. So I'm really looking forward to hearing an outline of the book from Liam, which we'll do first. Then we'll have responses from two brilliant panellists who I'll introduce when we get to that point. Then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions from you before we wrap up for drinks about 7:45. But first, Liam.
Indeed. Right, it's a huge pleasure to be here, and it's a huge pleasure to be sharing the stage with Bobby, because the work that Bobby's been doing here with the Policy Institute at King's, as a practicing politician, it's some of the most important research that we see in Westminster, just down the road. So I'm just going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes to share a few thoughts with you. That's about the average lifespan of a Tory Chancellor, as we say down the road. But these are thoughts which have benefited immeasurably from a few of the other panellists that you're going to hear from this evening. The book draws very heavily on a lot of their research, and the Fairness Foundation, who are here with Will Snell, who's just over here, who again doing some extraordinarily important work. So that's what I'm going to run through very quickly tonight. These are thoughts which have come together slowly and then quickly over the last 10 to 15 years. They're thoughts that I think could win Britain's vote and definitely would change Britain's future. And they are thoughts which begin with a tour of the absurdity of affluence. Because if, like me, you've been just watching some of these headlines with real kind of surprise and mystification, believe me, that is as of nothing when you go and see these things being made. And so as part of the research, I've been wandering around Rolls-Royce factories, and I've gone to see super yachts being made, and I've taken myself off to try and see private jets, but unfortunately they kind of cottoned on to what I was up to and wouldn't let me in. Or indeed, you know, any one of us could take a stroll down Phillimore Gardens, which is Britain's most expensive street, where the average price of a home, is £23 million. You could buy like an entire block in Hodge Hill for that. And what you see when you kind of, you do this tour is you just see the most extraordinary things. So if any of you have got £1 million to spare and you want to buy yourself a Rolls-Royce Phantom, well, it turns out that if you want that to be the, I don't know, the colour of an Amazonian tree frog, no problem. If you want that to match the colour of your private jets, it'll take a bit of time, but actually they can do that. If you want the interior roof to match the constellation that was in the night sky on the night you proposed to your loved one, no problem. The heights in these cars are taken from the highest mountains in South America so that they're not blemished by mosquito bites. I mean, the absurdity of affluence is just now something really to behold. But here's the point. Sales of private jets are now at an all-time high. Sales of Rolls-Royce cars are at an all-time high. Sales of super yachts are at an all-time high. We've got not one man, we've got 3 men racing each other into space. And yet, when I go home to Hodge Hill is the most income-deprived constituency in the country. We see stories like this. We literally, in my constituency, have food banks running out of food. I have a member of staff whose job it is to help coordinate food collection. We have people coming into our hospitals in Birmingham with rickets and malnourishment, diseases of the Victorian era. We have life expectancy in my constituency, which is 8 years lower than Sutton Coldfield, the nice wealthy bit up the road. So we've now got these extraordinary divisions between rich and poor, and I became convinced some years ago that it's the inequality of wealth that lies at the heart of our predicament. Now, we have been thinking and writing about the wealth of nations since this guy, who is Adam Smith, thank you, 1779, and I grew up in a family that worried about this. So that's my parents on the left-hand side in Glasgow in 1969. My parents were children of the 60s. They were anti-apartheid campaigners. They gave their lives to public service over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. And they had me in 1970. That's the earliest picture of me that I can find. As you can tell, I was born in the holy town of Warrington, 13 miles from Anfield, and never quite made it into the team. But look, this is what has happened since I was born. Since I was born, back in 1970, the wealth of our country has multiplied 100-fold. I don't think the two things are connected, but that is just what has actually turned out. And so when you kind of look at some of the key moments, quite interesting. So back in the fall of the Berlin Wall, that many of you are old enough to remember, China joins the World Trade Organization. But then look what happens over the long years of austerity. So through that years of what we call the ABC of British politics, austerity, Brexit and COVID, the wealth of the country has actually doubled. It's actually doubled up to about £12 trillion. Now, 12 trillion is a big number, I appreciate that. But if you take that standard unit of measurement, Land's End to John O'Groats, basically £12 trillion is enough to buy you 5 or 6 gold bars and lay a path of them all the way from Land's End to John O'Groats. That's how much £12 trillion is. But here's the problem. Since 2010, something has changed. For most of my life, you think about that little boy holding the football, for most of my life, wealth inequality was coming down. Since 2010, something fundamental has changed. Since 2010, wealth inequality has begun to go up, and it's begun to go up sharply. In fact, it's gone up so sharply that the top 1% have multiplied their wealth 31 times more than everybody else. So if you think about the super yachts and the luxury cars and the private jets and the food banks on the other hand, that's why. Because we now live in a country where wealth inequality is becoming very, very real. In fact, there's a great book by William Schneider, if you've not read it, I recommend it, which is a long, long run history of inequality. And he has this amazing statistic. He says, if you look back at the Roman Empire, the wealth of the richest was about 1.5 million times the average wages. And guess what? Look at the Sunday Times rich list from last year. The wealth of the richest family in Britain is now 1.3 million times average wages. So, at its most extremes, and of course I'm, exaggerating to make my point here, but at its most extreme, wealth inequality is now, frankly, almost Roman. Now, even if you don't care about the injustice of this, even if you don't care about that, you should care about this. Because when you look around the world at countries which are unequal, they have 3 things in common. They become poor, they become corrupt, and they become stagnant. And so, I started my story talking about the absurdity of affluence. And, some people accuse me of the politics of envy, and we shouldn't really worry, they say to me, about the conspicuous consumption. And I can see that argument. But it's not actually the conspicuous consumption that worries me. It's the inconspicuous consumption of power. I've been a member of parliament now for 20 years. I have never seen the amount of money running through the corridors of power as I see today. And that is just, I'm afraid, a simple truth. Wealth loves power like wasps love jam on a sunny day. And what you see now is big money coming into politics in a way that actually protects the privileges of wealth. And if we don't get a handle on that soon, then we are going to become poorer, we're going to become more corrupt, and social mobility is going to continue to collapse. It already takes the heirs of someone born poor 5 generations to rise up and earn even average wages. That's how bad social mobility in our country has become. And so this is going to get worse if we don't do something about it. And, you know, I started my political career in Millbank Tower back in 1996. We used to bounce to work singing "Things Can Only Get Better" every morning. And of course, the longer I've been in politics, the more you realise that actually things can also get worse. And this is going to get worse if we don't do something about it. Why? Because nothing's forever, including the baby boomers. Sorry to break that to you. And as the baby boomers shuffle off this mortal coil, we're about to see the biggest transfer of wealth in our history. £5.5 trillion is about to change hands. And of course, some will inherit fortunes and some will inherit care bills. And so Gen Z, this most extraordinary generation that is going to change the world, storm-born, they've been through conflict, crash and contagion across their young lives, they're going to become the most unequal generation for half a century unless we get a handle on the inequality of wealth. So, what's really telling, and this is some of the work that Bobby and I have done with Will, is that we're beginning to kind of roll back how the public feels about inequality now. And what is really striking is that the public is super clear. Wealth inequality is too high and it needs to come down. And what's intriguing is that when you ask the public what do they fear about rising levels of inequality, it is rising levels of corruption and unfair business influence on government. So the public has got a kind of a sixth sense of what happens when you get very, very high levels of inequality. And so that is why I wrote the book. This year is an extraordinary anniversary. It's the 10th anniversary of Thomas Piketty's wonderful book on capital that I know many of you will read. But as a practicing politician, it's felt to me that we've spent a lot of the last 10 years debating the problem, analysing the problem, dissecting the problem, debating the problem, circling around the problem, debating whether the problem is important or not important. But actually what we need are solutions. Not simply solutions that people are going to like on social media, but solutions people are actually going to vote for in a general election. And so what I'd like to share with you tonight is the back third of the book, which is a set of solutions which have been drawn together from across policy land, not just around Britain, but around the world. And these ideas are ideas that have all been tested and work somewhere. They're not mad, they're not pie in the sky, they're plausible, credible, and they would make a difference here to this country. And the framework is set out by this guy. So some of you will know this. Any guesses? James Mead, very good. So James Mead, disciple of Keynes, invented national income accounting, and Mead actually wrote a lot about wealth inequality in the 60s, and I'll kind of spare you the equation, but basically what Mead tells us is that if you're worried about wealth inequality, then you need to worry about these things. You need to worry about income, you need to worry about savings and the savings rate, you've got to worry about the returns that people get on those savings, and you've got to worry about tax. And basically what happens is that all those factors are, if all those factors are kind of working better for the rich, then the rich are going to carry on getting wealthier than everybody else. And so where that takes me as a plan, and who doesn't love a 5-point plan? All politicians are trained to give you 5-point plans, and so I'm afraid that is what you get in the back half of the book. It gives you an agenda that looks like this. You've got to have growth. And you can't just have growth somewhere. You can't just have growth in some parts of Britain. You've got to have growth in every part of Britain. Not just any old growth. You've got to have good growth, the kind of growth that actually gives you better paid jobs. You've got to actually move earnings up. You've got to introduce, I'll say a bit more about this in a sec, not, in my view, universal basic income, but universal basic capital. A sovereign wealth fund will help that with that. And then, crucially, you've got to restore fairness to the tax system. So, growth, I mean, you're going to hear from Keris in a minute. The IPPR had a brilliant commission on economic growth not long ago, and economic justice. Had a lovely line in it, which is that here in Britain, we don't have an economic model, we have an economic muddle. That is exactly right. But look, it's not rocket science in a way. We know that innovation is 85% of economic growth. We know that science spending globally has tripled since 2000, but only grown 40% here in this country. So we need to be investing more in science and innovation. Unless we grow smarter, we will grow poorer. But we've got to do that in a way that gives us radical devolution of economic power to the regions, to mobilise, to build institutions that mobilise people, ideas and money. Why? Because right now, all the good jobs, half of the good jobs that are knowledge-intensive jobs are in two regions. They're in London and the South East. Why are these kind of jobs so important? Because they pay a third more than an average job. That's about 160 quid extra a week. So if you want to make sure that Britain as a whole grows in good ways, then you've actually got to make sure that every part of Britain is building these knowledge-intensive jobs. We're only creating about 100,000 of these a year at the moment. It's much, much too low. Secondly, we've got to move up earnings. So this is a graph that goes back to 1955, and basically what it shows you is how does national income break down between capital and labour? And the story, you'll know the story, the share to labour income is going down rather than up. If it went up, there would be more money that went into pay packets. But how do you do that? well, one way you do that is by harnessing the power of pension savers. Together, those of you who are saving into a pension, we've got £2 trillion, £2 trillion of pension savings. But none of you know how to invest in companies that aren't screwing their workers or dodging their taxes or poisoning the planet. And so bringing together the 32,000 pension funds in Britain into a handful of super funds like Canada, like Australia, and then empowering pension savers to actually invest in good firms creates a huge shift in the way that the capital market works. It's what I call in the book civic capitalism, and it will work if you couple it with boardroom reform, like, putting workers on boards, that kind of thing. So that's idea two. Now, if you've got higher earnings, if you've got higher wages, then you need to also raise savings. Now, let's just so how many young people in here want to buy? Well, okay, how many people in here would like to buy a house but can't afford one? Right, it's about a third of the audience. So if you think about the kind of capital that you've got to develop over the course of your life, you've got to develop knowledge capital, that's kind of why you're here, you've got to develop pension capital, and you've got to develop housing capital. And right now it's impossible because no one can afford to save because the pressures on the cost of living. But actually creating, universalising savings accounts, just been tried by Nest, they're very successful, and then restructuring this, so this hasn't quite come out, but this is what Richard Titmuss used to call fiscal welfare. We have about £60 billion in subsidies that go to people who already have assets. Making sure that we actually put this on a progressive footing, so we're giving incentives to those who don't have savings into their universal savings account, would be one of the ways that we actually help democratise capital. A quarter of people in Britain today, have savings of less than £100. So actually creating a system of universal basic capital is fundamental to building a wealth-owning democracy. Now, for young people, there is one payment we should put into this account that is super important. And this is an idea that's been tested by the IPPR, creating a £10,000 dividend that goes into, either as a tax break or a savings match, into these accounts, transforms the ability of young people to get a home to call their own. You can't build your way out of a housing crisis. You do need rent reform, you do need more homes, but crucially, you've got to help people put together the money for a deposit. Now, where would that money come from? Well, ultimately, it could come from something called a sovereign wealth fund, or a national wealth fund, or a Commonwealth fund. Again, really good IPPR idea. 80 countries around the world are building them. Isn't it a shame that we didn't keep the proceeds of North Sea oil? If we'd done that, we'd have had one of these funds. There would be £500 billion in it, but we didn't, so let's learn the lesson from the past and actually start putting aside that money today. And that fund will be faster to build if we restore fairness to the tax system. Now, I don't know how many people in here have read Rishi Sunak's tax return. Lucky I've done it for you. So Rishi Sunak has published his tax return, that's a good thing. What that shows is income of about 2 million. Anyone want to guess Rishi Sunak's tax rate? 21%. So somebody who's on 2 million a year is currently paying 21% tax, when 1 in 5 people are paying 40% tax. How can this be, you ask yourselves? Well, look at how our economy's changed. So as wealth has tripled this century, you can see the grey bars, so household wealth up to nearly 12 trillion. The income from investment has doubled. It's doubled up to about 80 billion. And guess who gets that money? You're right. Most of it goes to the top 10%. And guess what? They're paying half the rate of tax of everybody else. So you've got a situation now where those who are doing best from investment income in Britain are actually paying amongst the lowest tax rates of everybody. Yet think about how we're going to transfer wealth to the next generation. Think about how you would build a national wealth fund. Think about how you could actually give young people a flying start in life if you had such a fund. And now think about the whys and wherefores of returning fairness to the tax system. It is wrong that Rishi Sunak pays half the rate of tax of a senior teacher or a senior police officer. And people like Aaron Avani and the National Wealth Tax Commission have done an immense amount of work putting together a whole range of options for how this is done. So that is a very quick canter through, Bobby, the kind of ideas that are in the book. They've all been done somewhere. They're all plausible, they're all possible. They're not simply radical. They're things that people, I think, could actually vote for. And I suppose the final point I wanted to leave you with is about optimism. Because what politics needs more than anything else right now is not simply a council of despair. It's not people telling you that it's all going to be dreadful. People need to provide a council of hope. Think about what is going to happen over the decades to come. A baby born today could see in the 22nd century the transformation of artificial intelligence or global gigabit connectivity or genetic medicine or the transition to green energy. These things are going to transform our world. And the question that we've got to answer is, how does that great new world of possibility, how does it translate into a different kind of freedom for us in the 21st century? How do we make sure that the extraordinary possibilities created by the 90% of scientists who ever lived are alive today and are at work? They're going to change the future. How do we make sure that's a new settlement of freedom for us? And I guess the argument of the book is that we should be ambitious about that, but remember that there is no freedom without security, and there is no security without wealth. And that is why we've got to revive an old idea, which is the wealth-owning democracy. Thanks very much indeed.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Liam, for that brilliant, masterful overview of a book. Always really hard to do when you've been working on a book for a long time. It's very long, and you have to condense it into these 15, 20 minutes, but you did it brilliantly. So we're going to go straight over to our panellists and get thoughts from them. And we're delighted to have Anoush Shakelian, who's the Britain editor of The New Statesman, which covering politics, society and culture. We'll hear from Anoush first. And then we'll hear from Karis Roberts, who's the executive director of the Institute for Public Policy Research. Anoush.
Thank you. Thanks. And first of all, I think I just wanted to say this is a really good time to have this conversation. I think Liam's book is really timely, not just because of the levels of wealth inequality that your presentation and your book demonstrate, but also I think the public's awareness of the issue, it has really risen. So you can tell that from the polling that you cite in your book, but also this sort of morbid fascination with the super rich seems particularly high at the moment. So from Saltburn to Succession, Parasite to Below Deck, there's an awareness in the popularity of these programmes that there is something quite dark going on at the top, and that these people play by the different rules to the rest of us, but also that more light should be shone on what's going on. And there's also a growing awareness among the wealthy themselves of the unjust nature of the way wealth is distributed. So we have the patriotic millionaires movement. These are wealthy people who want to sort of be taxed more fairly. And the former trader turned economist Gary Stevenson, who's a British millionaire, his new book is coming out this week and will hopefully draw more attention to that movement. And also you see high-profile figures like the CEO of Centrica, Chris O'Shea, who said just last week that his £4.5 million pay couldn't be justified. And I think to go along with this, there should be more attention on this subject from progressives and the liberal left. I mean, for me as a journalist for a centre-left magazine, I'm more likely to be reporting on food banks than in the corridors of Canary Wharf or at a private jet show or whatever it is that didn't let you in, Liam. And that's, you know, that's understandable. But I do think that it's important for us to take seriously how the top 1% feel and work beyond the same old sort of lazy attacks on politicians or public individuals for being wealthy. And as Liam's book details, they are buying access and dictating how markets work in their favour. So it's time for us to take this seriously as well. But I would also add on top of Liam's focus that we should try and understand the top 10%. So not just the super rich, but also those who are feeling a little bit bruised lately. You saw in the backlash to Labour's VAT charge on private schools just this week, people on salaries of around 60k saying they aren't wealthy, even though they're in the top decile of income. And they make a distinction between the super rich who can afford those fees for Winchester, Rishi Sunak's old school, and people like them who they say have just been saving, scrimping and saving to send their children to a local private school. And it's tempting to scoff, I think, at these stories, but there's a serious lesson because there is a real inequality high up the scale. So first there's the wealth divide, which is much higher than the income divide. And Liam's book details well how wealth is amassing at the very top. So you've got some really eye-catching stats in your book. The average wealth of an individual in the top 1% of Britain's richest increased 31 times more than of those in the bottom 99% between 2010 and 2021. And another stat that caught my eye in his book is that overall wealth in the UK rose £4 trillion in that same period, nearly a quarter of which went just to the top 1%. And so it's not the most egregious economic divide in our country, but the top 1% are pulling away from the top 10% in terms of income at a drastic rate as well. So those in the top 5% who earn 82,200 and above are much closer to the national median than they are to the top 1%, and that's 183k and above, where wealth is rapidly accumulating. So there is a true divide at the top as well that people are feeling. And I was encouraged by the polling that Liam cites in his book, and he shared it with me actually, that you and Bobby did together, on shifting attitudes towards the impact of wealth inequality among the British public. And from what I can see from those polling results, there are some quite interesting changes. There's a rising awareness of the outsized influence a wealth gap like we have here can bring to a narrow group. For example, the public now think the very rich today are more powerful than governments, and that's switched in just 5 years. And just a fifth of people now believe wealth is gained through hard work rather than other factors outside of their control, like inheritance, family, schooling. So it does seem that there is room to make the argument here about why the wealth gap ought to be closed, despite the usual hurdle of Brits generally seeing wealth as something that's aspirational and a sort of legitimate thing to pursue for the security of yourself and your family. But from looking at some of the polling on the solutions, I thought that the picture was slightly more complicated. So reducing tax avoidance is 31% of people's top choice out of the different options that you presented to them in your polling, compared with just 8% who would prioritise taxing capital gains at the same level as income, for example, and that would fix the Rishi Sunak tax return problem. And our own polling at the New Statesman, because we've done a lot of work on attitudes towards wealth, salary and class with Redfield and Wilton, which is a polling company, suggests that people are very likely to sort of underestimate where they sit on the income scale compared with the average. So I'll just give you a few of our findings. So no matter their income, people are far more likely to feel they have a below average income than above average income compared with the general population. And Brits are also far more likely to believe their social circle is better off than worse off than they are, and that's no matter where you sit on the scale. And even those on very high incomes have a tendency to feel less fortunate than their social circle. So 43% of those with a household income of 100 to 120,000 consider their social circle better off than they are. So people are generally, it's almost like it's human nature, they're comparing themselves to those above them than those below. And we found some really stark results that basically suggest it's never going to be straightforward for any politician or political party to work out where to pitch a wealth tax or a higher rate of income tax on top earners. So, for example, a quarter of Brits on 100k told us they identify as working class. And class is a whole different conversation, but I do think that's interesting. 60% of British voters on 80 to 100 grand told us they are about average on the income scale. Obviously, they weren't Googling while they were doing our survey. And over half of Brits on significantly more than the median salary, which is 34,900 before tax, say they are about average for UK households. So this is why it's very challenging to rebalance the wealth divide for Labour, which has struggled, from its 2015 mansion tax on £2 million properties and above that they proposed before the 2015 election, to the 2019 election plan for a 45p tax rate on earnings over 80k, and now you can see it a little bit in the backlash to that VAT charge on private schools. And as Liam and I discussed in a recent interview that we did that will be out in the New Statesman soon, this is why his plans could potentially form a programme for government, if they're that way inclined, rather than something the leadership risks voicing in the build-up to a general election.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Thanks, and thanks to Liam for writing the book, which I was absolutely delighted to read, and partly because it doesn't fear to stray into three difficult domains for politicians. So one is analysing capitalism, its history and its dynamics, but it does that without then veering off into a utopian final chapter with a kind of wish list of every policy under the sun, but instead has really politically and practically road-tested ideas, and so that was really refreshing. And then thirdly, it was a really unashamedly moral book. And it raises a kind of moral politics that I think too often is missing in these discussions as we think about a kind of instrumental view of where policy can get us. So thank you. I think in terms of my comments, I wanted to touch a bit on some of the diagnosis of how we got here and where we're going, which I think is a really rich section of the book, actually, and then a bit on the policy as well. So on those dynamics, I think there were three that really struck out to me. One is the kind of changing nature of the economy and the concentration of power and wealth within certain firms. And so Liam writes in the book about the kind of monopolies that we see in the economy. It's not just in tech, but there is a big tech element to this story because the big tech firms have network effects whereby they can gain huge power and returns from having essentially access to large data sets. And I think this is a really important, it kind of occupies a slightly nerdy space in the debate in the UK, but actually, if you look at the US debate, it's highly political. You see Joe Biden going after Ticketmaster, for example, and the fees that he puts on things. The second one that really, you talked more about this in your opening, is the threat to democracy from having this very high degree of affluence, and that's very much a global story, actually, if you look at how capital is flowing around the world, where it's being hidden, and how that is shaping politics abroad, but also here. I think that's a really stark reminder of some of the effects of this, as well as how the very wealthy can rewrite the rules of the game and legislation in order to enrich themselves further. And then the third, and Bobby, I imagine you might comment on this too, is this incredibly important dynamic of not just intergenerational inequality, so inequalities between generations, but also what is happening within generations. So essentially, the fact that younger generations are going to experience much deeper levels of inequality driven by the kind of boomer housing boom than older generations. And I think that we haven't really reckoned yet with what that's going to do with our politics and the difficulty of addressing some of that politically, because you do have political coalitions around that higher housing wealth. In terms of the policy and what we do about it, I mean, anyone who reads the book will see there's quite a few IPPR ideas in there, which I was really delighted to see. We ran a commission on economic justice a few years back, and in that we talked about lots of the ideas such as growth through innovation and devolution, but also democratising the returns to wealth through a wealth fund, looking at non-doms, equalising capital gains tax. So it was just a real pleasure to read this kind of median, by which I mean James Mead, not median, liberal property owning democracy vision that builds the wealth of ordinary people. I think in terms of the policy, and these might be questions for you to come back to, Liam, I think there were kind of two thoughts I was having of kind of, you know, as you know, I'm a big advocate for that vision, but is it enough? And are there places where we need to go further? And I think the two areas where I was thinking that One is that, you could have perfectly equally distributed wealth, but it's also about what we can provide collectively. And so if we have social housing, if we have a safety net that catches you when you lose your job, if we have a social care system that works, you actually don't need wealth on the same level. And so I think that when we think about wealth, we should also be thinking about what we do collectively and what that means for the wealth that people need and what it affords them in life. The second point was really, you've got this beautiful analysis, if quite horrifying, of the super rich and their influence on our politics and policy. And I think, a proper tax system would go some way to addressing this, but I think we also need to think about power dynamics in the economy and how those people can amass that great wealth. And one of the reasons why you had rising wages through much of the 20th century was collective bargaining and the strength of unions. And I do think we need to think about how we can strengthen worker power, but also how we can address the huge inequalities of power between different firms in the economy. So thinking about a kind of competition and market set of interventions as well. And I think, that's a very rounded picture. It's ambitious. I'm not the politician. I get to be the think tanker who can suggest these ideas. But I think those, along with that vision of the property-owning democracy, would be a fantastic set of ideas to endorse.
Cool. Thank you very much. Great stuff. So I'm going to come to Liam for some reflections on that. But if I can just throw in a couple of my own kind of thoughts or questions to you, or things to reflect on from it as well. Because I think really useful for Anoush to highlight that change in public opinion from it used to be in 2018, people thought government were the most powerful, had the most influence in the country. Now people say it's the very rich. And as an opinion pollster, that type of turnaround in a relatively short period of time is a really important signal, I think, for people. But then Anoush also and others picked up on the misperceptions that people have around this. And obviously we've done loads of work on people's misperceptions. And I think the key thing to understand about misperceptions is that it's not just the case that if we corrected those misperceptions, people would change their minds and view things differently. These are much more emotional and identity-driven perceptions, visions of reality than they are factual, open buckets that we can just put facts into for people. So we need to bear that in mind too. And the second point I'll just link to that is the point about a moral vision, because there's a bit an element of here about whose moral vision for a country as a whole, because again, we've done lots of work in how people have different starting points on this, whether they see the world structurally, where people are either helped forward or held back, or individualistically, where they could see actually success is down to you. And it's still that meritocratic tendency or reflex within the UK is still pretty strong. So taking those two kind of things together, the public opinion and the underlying moral or values diversity that we have in the country, I guess my questions are to you around that. How do we take people with us on this?
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. So I think, Anoush makes a really important political point about coalition building, actually, because the reality is that, again, I'm loath to sort of say this in such stark terms, given the number of young people in the room, but we kind of live in a gerontocracy in this country. So when you correct for the number of people who are registered and the number of people who turn out, you've probably got 40% of voters are over the age of 55. And many of those will have assets like homes, like pensions, that will put them in that top 10%.
Yeah.
And you know what? You can't win an election without them. Why? Because they turn out and they're registered to vote and they're 40% of the electorate. And so you have got to think, I think, in quite a smart way about how you build that coalition. You know, the top 1% may be beyond us of a political project, not all of them, but most. But actually, there will be people within that top 10% that you do need to persuade. And that's why I think the generational argument is so important. Because, Bobby's book has been very influential on me here, but I think people are now ready for a conversation about how we look after the generations that are coming through now, because people know their predicament is so screwed. And when you've got so much media now talking about how we live in an inheritocracy, people know that that doesn't sit right with them. People know that that's wrong. And actually, one of the really kind of striking things in the research that Bobby and I did was that polling number that showed, and you picked it out actually, people no longer think hard work is the key to success in life. People now think it's the family you're born into, the networks you've got, or education. People now think hard work is fourth on the list. You know, and when I put that to David Willits, he just said, Mrs. Thatcher would be turning in her grave, you know, if she had sort of seen that notion. So that's why I think there is a political opportunity. And I think how you then present it, you're not going to win this argument overnight, and your point about a moral argument is right. And what's then fascinating is if you look at all the big change manifestos since the war, so if you look at 1945, 1964, 1979, 1997, each of those uses the word radical once. But what they do is they say, do you know what? We're heading in the wrong direction, aren't we? The incumbents, they've all gone a bit mad, haven't they? Do you know what we need? We need a change of direction. We need to return to common sense. And I think in a way that the switch of direction is the way that you present your moral argument. You need to be able to kind of say, look, it's time that we went back to common sense. We believe that the next generation should have a fair share and a fair shot. We believe that hard work should pay and help you get on in life. Those things aren't happening right now, are they? We need a change of direction. And when you frame your debate in that way, it's much easier, I think, to win an argument for things like a more progressive tax system. Now, all of that has to assume something really important that Keris underlined, which is that you have got to finish the kind of care, learn, save revolution in the social contract, and in particular, putting in place universal childcare, making sure that there is sensible social care here, you know, making sure you've got strong collective bargaining. In a way, I'm guilty of that economist trick of saying, first assume a Labour government, and then kind of work back from there. So, you know, you definitely need those, and those things will need tax revenue too. But I think the politics of it now, I'm now more convinced than ever before that the way you win an argument here is by arguing about a change of direction.
Very good. Just to come back to the panel, just see if there's any pick-up on that, and then I'll come to the audience for questions. I think we've got microphones somewhere coming. Yeah, we've got microphones coming. So if you've got any questions, do have a think. And you can see we're all slightly furiously agreeing with ourselves on the stage. So if anyone's got a dissenting voice, I'll particularly favour that. But any reflections on what Liam came back with?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that there is more and there's mileage to be had in sort of harnessing the concern among older generations for the next generation. So I've just been in Port Talbot today, interviewing the steel workers who may be losing their jobs. And it was interesting because some of the older boys, you know, who've been in steel for decades, the main thing they were talking about, they weren't necessarily, you know, as worried about their own situation, but they were really worried about the apprentices who they've been coaching, you know, to, you know, become fitters in the steel plant from the age of 16. They were so worried about the future for those kids. And, you know, there's going to probably be a free port there and on some of the land that will be given up by Tata Steel. And they were saying it will probably be an Amazon warehouse for these kids, having been trained, you know, in quite specialist skills, because they just won't have the industry to transfer those skills to. And so I think, you know, and even sort of in focus groups that I sit in, often the older people in the focus groups will be talking about how worried they are about their grandchildren and their prospects for owning a home or finding a stable job, or they'll just be expressing frustration that their grown-up kids still live with them. And so I do think there's a lot of political mileage in, you know, even as you say, you know, you do rely on certain generations to turn out to vote, so you do have to appeal to them. But I think there's definitely a message here about the injustice that resonates with them. So I think that's something for Labour and, well, whatever political party wants to be successful to explore. Yeah.
I think that coalition building at the narrative level, you can see how that could be done. I think it's when you get to the policy details that it gets really tricky, particularly on housing, actually, because, you know, low interest rates, for example, have boosted the housing wealth of people who already have it or who could access a deposit. look at what's happening now in terms of how people feel if those rates don't stay that low. So that's where you get the kind of really tricky trade-offs, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reflecting just how quickly that generational vision for the future has changed. So in 2003, half the UK public thought things were going to be better for the younger generation than it was for their parents. And then from mid-2010s onwards, those figures reversed. So it was only a quarter of people think it's going to be better and half think it's going to be worse for future generations. So the key point there is it's not normal to think that things are going to be progressively worse for the coming generation. So there is that sense of change thing is an important point. That is not the norm. Very good. So if nothing else from here, though, we've got lots of questions. There's a microphone there, so let's go right at the back. We'll come here.
Hello. So thank you very much, Liam. It is a really fascinating book and a fascinating study, and it's good to see that at least some of our elected officials care about things that seem pretty intrinsic to how our future builds. But a lot of what you describe seems quite unprecedented, or at least in our lifetimes. The problems that you're outlining seem quite radical, and it seems like the British people, the polling shows that we're aware of it. But then why do we reject radical politics, do you think?
Very good. Let's hold that one and get a couple more. I'll just come forward. Can we go into the aisle? Yeah, that'd be great. There and then there, across the aisle, and then come down the front a bit.
Yeah, you say the rich pay a very small percentage of tax to the UK revenue. Is that because under international law they are having to pay tax to overseas countries for the money that they're actually earning?
Great. Do you mind passing along to that? And then we'll do another round down here in a minute. Yeah.
Amanda McIntyre from the For Baby's Sake Trust. I think it's really interesting what you're talking about in terms of care for the next generation. So our charity works with parents to break the cycle of domestic abuse. They're motivated by their baby. I also wanted to flag the point about hope and ask maybe, Liam, if you could say a bit more about how to build the hope and the optimism. One of the most interesting speeches I heard about what create the barriers to systemic change, even when the evidence makes the case for it, is a psychological thing. It's guilt, it's shame, and it's fear of chaos. And that stops people from making these leaps. Hope and optimism is on the other side of the equation that helps people get out of jail. And so how do you build the hope? How do you build the optimism?
Great questions. Liam.
So the radical politics question. So I've been thinking and working on this for about 10 years, and of course, what you get into, especially with elections about to hit us, is you will always get one side playing the politics of loss aversion, and it's remarkable how little behavioural economics is debated in politics. But loss aversion basically tells you that people fear losses twice as much as they cherish gains. And so political parties in general, Labour Party in particular, is always vulnerable to people playing the politics of loss aversion against them. And so the political parties need to think more carefully about how that they present not just radical politics, but plausible politics. And there are actually a number of ways of doing this. And some of my research has just shown that if, for example, you can show that there is not a complete cross-party consensus on something, but even a couple of parties agreeing about a particular idea, that de-risks the idea in the mind of voters. If you explain the way that a policy was developed, that de-risks the idea in the minds of voters. So there is so much, part of our challenge today is that there is so much cynicism about the possibilities of politics. We've never had such a gap between how big the problems are and how low the trust is. There's a real problem today with offering ideas that sound bold because people believe just nothing is possible. Nothing is possible. Everything is kind of broken. And so in a way, that's why the book was written as a 3-term project, because What's noticeable is that the manifesto after a big change manifesto tends to be the really radical document. So if you look at the Labour second manifesto or the Tory second manifesto after the 79 election, that's when people really begin to lean into the wind. And so it could be the conclusion is that you've got to take voters on a journey, basically, and you can't just promise it all on day one. You've got to offer a change of direction and then make sure you're systematically moving in a reform direction. And to be honest with you, if you don't start that work straight away after an election, you lose the opportunity to do it. And in a way, I'll put this diplomatically. So in a way, the book is written because I want to make sure that the next Labour government in power gets down to work on some bold ideas immediately, even if it is quite a cautious manifesto. So that's not a perfect answer, but it's a kind of a reflection of the fact that there are ways to render something plausible rather than simply radical. But I think I'm more convinced now that you have to take people on a journey than just offer it on day one. You want to come back, I think.
I was just wondering if you're concerned that the slight breaking of the social contract will radicalise people. So,
Yes,
Brexit
in a big way.
can be seen as part of that. And
Yeah.
about how home ownership is kind of a dream for a lot of young people. And I've always seen Britain as having a high percentage of home ownership, which de-radicalises our politics. Right? If your family wealth is built into property prices, you kind of go that you're saying loss of ownership, which I think is a really good thing.
So I was really influenced by some of the work. So some of you will have heard Ben Ansell's very good Ruth lectures over Christmas. So Ben's done lots of quite interesting work on places where wealth gain didn't keep up with the national average. And what that work shows in Britain, in France, in Scandinavia and America is that the places where wealth didn't keep up with the national average were the places that voted for Brexit, Le Pen, the far right and Trump. So that's today. Now think if inequality gets much worse in the future. If you think the gaps are going to get worse. Politics, if we don't fix the inequality of wealth now, politics is going to become even more unstable in the future. Populism will rise stronger. And in many ways, the opposite of populism is separatism. So you will get pressures on the United Kingdom and whether the United Kingdom will hold together. So, you know, this can dissolve the joints that holds nations together if you don't get this right. And so that's, you know, that's where the kinetic energy for the book came from, I suppose, because I'm genuinely now really quite alarmed about this. So on tax, no, the key thing is that tax on capital gains is 20% compared to high rate tax of 40%. That was a change that the last Labour government made. In fact, I asked Rishi Sunak about his tax return at the liaison committee just before Christmas, and he said, no, it's fine that I pay a lower rate of tax because Gordon Brown was the one who introduced it. And of course, that was before we put £850 billion of quantitative easing into the monetary system to keep interest rates low, but we didn't quite get into that. And Amanda, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, all politics is a mixture of fear and hope, and that's a recipe that goes back to the Pilgrim's Progress. But I think right now, I'm supremely worried there's not enough hope around. And it's why there's an old trope in politics is, you know, you've got to own the future. And politicians in Westminster, they go around, you know, imparting this wisdom to each other that you've got to own the future, you know. And they say, yeah, you've got to own the future. and no one ever sort of says, well, what's going to happen in the future, you know? And the truth is that amazing things are about to happen. Literally 90% of the scientists who are ever alive are alive today and at work. The things that they're going to create are going to be amazing. The question is whether we translate that into the freedom to be you for each and every one of us, because we could do that if we so chose.
Great stuff. Anything from the panel on?
Yeah, on the rejection of radical politics question, I think in terms of this debate that we're having on sort of, I suppose, fixing the wealth divide, wealth taxes, income tax, inheritance tax, whatever, the reason why it's sort of so, the Labour Party is so reluctant to sort of come out with any commitments on these things ahead of an election is because I think this is still Britain and there is still, you know, despite all the polling that we've been talking about, the shifts in public attitudes, there is a really strong meritocratic streak in people's thinking. And actually the work that we've done, and I didn't bring the stats with me on this, shows that younger people actually have more faith in meritocracy than older people who we surveyed, to the extent that they felt that, you know, it's much easier for people to move between classes. I think the starkest stat that we had from that polling was that Gen Z and millennials will class Marcus Rashford as upper class because of his money, whereas the people surveyed who are in older groups would class him as working class because they see class as bound up in other things rather than just money. And so there is, we called it the Molly May meritocracy. I don't know if you remember Molly May, the celebrity who said, you know, we all have the same 24 hours in the day, so, you know, we all should just be working harder to achieve the same things. So there is that streak there, and you can't deny that. And that's why I think it's very difficult, without spooking the public, to suggest that you might be taking money away from people, even if it's money that they, you know, have very little hope in the world of gaining themselves. I think the mansion tax policy is a perfect example of that. Not many people live in what was classed as a mansion under that proposal, but it did end up being quite unpopular. So I would agree with Liam in terms of the sort of caution in terms of campaigning, but then introducing some change that you can build trust to bring in a second. Well, you can start the work in the first term, but in a second term as well.
I think one of the most radical politicians of recent years has been George Osborne. Possibly not popular in this room, I don't know. But I say that because he had a kind of silent radicalism to what he did. He made the case for austerity on the grounds of balancing the books, rather than what he was actually doing, which was shifting, implementing a huge shift away from state provision towards private wealth. You know, low interest rates were partly a reaction to the lack of demand in the economy. Why do I raise that? Well, it does raise two things for me. One is he was very good at connecting his ideas to people's values, not his own values. And I think there is something in that in terms of how we talk about these ideas and how we connect them to people who might not be thinking about this day to day. And then I think the other thing he did was not presenting them as radical. So that's why I said silent radicalism. Yeah. These are not radical ideas. Almost all of these, I think, have been taking place either in recent history in Britain or in other countries, and they're not radical ideas, and we shouldn't talk about them as such.
Yes, very good, very interesting. So just a quick observation on that. I mean, it is really important to remember that if you were kind of lining countries up in their support for a meritocratic view of success, we are very mid-Atlantic, in some ways much closer to the US, and our kind of starting point for actually you can get on with hard work and talent and those types of things. And it is shifting, but we were still in that mid-Atlantic space compared to lots of the rest of it. And again, not surprising that the younger generations are in that kind of thing, because this is all about how you're socialised in your formative years and what help you see and can expect during those formative years. And just to throw in one thing that I found really striking from Liam's polling is that when we ask people what's the best approaches to dealing with the housing crisis, so the inequality in housing, the big gap was younger generations not picking social housing. So both Gen Z and millennials, it doesn't even really occur to them anymore that social housing is an option for it, because it's all been kind of stripped away. And I think that we're in a little inflection point here, that if that is not made part of the discussion and solution quite soon, I think it will disappear from cohorts' memory that this is an option. So I think that those types of things about when you're associated, this generational frame on this is really important, because it is what is our collective memory for what the solutions are, or otherwise you've got, as Liam says, a very long journey to bring people back with you. Anyway, that's. We've got another round, I think, and I will concentrate on the front and do the sides. These two guys were up early, so yes, please, and then we'll go one there and one there. Maybe try four. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. There seem to me to be some uncanny parallels between this debate and the one at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century with the early creation of the early welfare state. Now, turning rapidly 100 years, my question is the Labour Party correct to have this management of expectations that whatever may happen at the next election, that there will not be the kind of changes to the public services which people are crying out for.
Great question. Behind you.
Thanks very much for a fascinating presentation, and good to have a lot of policy ideas. I'd like to focus on the particular idea of sovereign wealth funds, which I think is probably the most important part of the idea of transferring wealth among the generations. And two elements. One is in terms of framing, whether Atkinson's view of public sector wealth versus private sector wealth might be a useful way of explaining this. And it's particularly relevant in the example you're using, Bobby, of social housing as a way that people can have good housing without having to take a mortgage. The other thing is where we're going to get the money for a sovereign wealth fund big enough to make this transformation. And I mean, I think two questions there. One is we may have to look not just in terms of private wealth, but corporate wealth to see some way in which we're going to transfer enough funds, and possibly that we're going to have to, this fund may need to have some investment element in order to make sure that it actually grows. The other thing, again, is what's the best way of explaining and distributing it? And in a way, what we are talking about is a fund that will ensure that a number of the pressures that are coming down the line, including the aging population, social care, housing, and perhaps the effect of technology, need to be funded. So I'm wondering whether the capital dividend is the only way to go, or whether we should frame this more as something to give the next generation the things that they otherwise are not going to have.
Very good, very good. So I'm going to take two more and try and take one from each wing. So there was one over here, and then, yes. Yes, you go, please.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to touch on the point where you had opinion polls saying that wealth is more powerful than government, but also the point that tech companies have this kind of access to big data. And basically just ask the panel if you think that the government has these skills and expertise to actually implement these kind of policies with the level of kind of data analysis capabilities it has, again, any skills and kind of tools.
So the question is, does the government have the capabilities to use the power of the data?
Yes, and especially kind of, it's going to be an adversarial relationship, right, with kind of actors who are with their own interests in mind, and it's going to be a bit of a...
Okay, yeah, how does government hold its own against the tech? Yeah, very good, yeah. Last one, yeah, in the middle.
So Bobby earlier asked for dissenting questions, so I'm going to try one. So is it not possible that you're absolutely right that there is a democratic basis for doing this and people will support it, but also that the public are right that actually government's time has gone and you're no longer as powerful as the people you seek to regulate, and that in the attempt to institute 5 policies that are individually popular but collectively perhaps less popular, all of these very, very wealthy, very, very powerful people will simply either frustrate you to death or disappear to California where the tax is lower and the weather is better?
God, we're really getting into it now.
Yeah, great final. So I'll take that. That's the final question. So if we have some final answering those questions, and then any final thoughts from people.
Well, I mean, let me start with this, because if you study dystopian novels, right, something quite interesting has happened. So if you go back to, I don't know, dystopian novels after the war, you know, through to the 60s, the kind of the bad guys were jaded, cynical, lax, a bit useless. You know, what they weren't is hell-bent on world destruction, which is how the wealthy are now portrayed in dystopian novels. So there's definitely, our culture is reflecting an inner fear, which is why, you know, Anoush is right to say Succession or Saltburn or, you know, Above Deck, Below Deck. I mean, I've had to watch all these bloody things for the research. But of course, what's going on there? I mean, what's going on there is a choreographed mockery of upstartish behaviour, which is evolutionarily an efficient way that we deal with those who have got ideas above their station. So I kind of think that people really are worried about exactly the point that you make. But, you know, we've got to defend democratic capitalism. And if we're going to defend democratic capitalism, then we're going to need to change it. And I think, you know, in a way, the challenge that I present in the book is to kind of say, look, here's a problem. Most people agree there's a problem. It's going to get worse. Most people agree it's going to get worse. Here's some ideas that could fix it. Okay, if you disagree with the ideas, tell me the better ideas because you agree that there's a problem. And so in a way, the book will have succeeded, if you like, if it provokes a debate about a whole wide range of solutions that are better ideas than the ideas in the book. So I suppose that's the plea of the book, really, is tell me some better ideas than these, please, because, you know, God love us down in Westminster, we need fresh thinking, and we need better thinking than we've got available today. I mean, I won't go into the Liz Truss Growth Commission, but I mean, that's a pretty good barometer of where some of the debate is today. So on this point about data analysis, this is a really important point. So at the moment, we run growth strategy in the worst possible way, which is by centralising everything in a couple of departments down the road. And so we end up taking loads of bad decisions. And so getting decisions out into a distributed environment called cities, towns and regions is a much better way in which you can bring together information, the information that is needed to make decisions well. And I've seen this as Chief Secretary of the Treasury. You know, the kind of decisions that we make in Westminster are mad. I mean, we make decisions without any idea what we're doing. And it's because we just don't have that information-rich environment that is needed to make good decisions. And we should be just devolving the power to do it. But of course, you know, the centrifugal powers of the state are very powerful. Sovereign wealth funds, we could have a really long debate about this. I mean, the key point on distribution, and your points are really thoughtfully posed. On distribution, I reflect on the Child Trust Fund and how easy it was to cancel it. And so I concluded, I think a bit like the IPPR, that you probably need to make a significant payment to a small number of people rather than a small payment to a lot of people. Full disclosure, we did poll on this, and the most popular way to spend the return from a sovereign wealth fund is higher pensions. So, there is definitely an argument to win to say, no, guys, can we use this money to actually help the next generation rather than those who have already got a home? And then on the early welfare state, I mean, I think this is a really thoughtful question too, because in a way, why do we think the welfare state is finished? The welfare state needs to change as the country changes. And Beveridge was basically focused on how do you ameliorate interruptions to earnings. And what we should be doing now is thinking about how we maximise the potential of earnings. But Beveridge never created a savings dimension to the welfare state. And actually, he didn't really create much of a care dimension in the sense of childcare and social care either. And so why aren't we more ambitious about the way the welfare state needs to be in the future is one of the questions I ask myself a lot. And I think the welfare state should help build the wealth-owning democracy, which is why I rehearse ideas like universal basic capital.
Very cool.
Yeah, I wanted to come in on that question as well. I think it's a really good one because I think particularly during the pandemic, or maybe just after sort of the shock of it had passed, there was a lot of talk, particularly on the left, that this is our 1945 moment. It's time to reset everything and, talk about care and talk about welfare and how we relate to one another. And, this will bring about the big change. And obviously there have been changes, but it's not really brought about that moment. And Labour, or at least the Labour leadership, certainly aren't voicing that. And I think you picked that up when you said they're sort of practicing a management of expectations in terms of how they'll run public services. And I know this is sort of frustrating to those who don't agree with that approach, but as far as I understand it, although there is a huge appetite for public services to improve, within that top team, and you'll know more about this than I do, Liam, there is also a sort of profound sense that the public is really cynical about the ability of any political party to actually change how things are at the moment. I think they see apathy as their biggest hurdle. And so Starmer thinks that it would sort of sound a bit jarring if he goes and gives these tub-thumping speeches about how the NHS is going to be better than ever. It might sound a bit disappointing for those of us who want to hear a more optimistic message, and whoever mentioned hope, I think that was a really good point. You do have to have some hope even in times where things feel, you know, quite miserable, and you can't imagine how things could possibly be fixed. I think that's the calculation there. And actually there is a lot of what I call policy scepticism out there. So I've sat in on focus groups where, you know, the person running the group will give Labour's Great British Energy Policy out, sort of written, you know, in very simple language on a piece of paper to the participants, and they'll all say, oh, that's a really great idea, really like that idea. And then they'll say, okay, so would you vote for Labour, you know, on the basis of that? And they say, oh, but they'll never do it. And it's not a Labour-specific thing. It's a politics thing. I mean, it's really sad, but you can't necessarily blame people given the amount of promises that have been made to them that have been broken, particularly in terms of levelling up. You know, you talked about making sure that sort of regions have and local areas have more power over their lives, and that hasn't been given to them, and it has been promised to them.
I think Anisha summarised the politics of this very well. Just from a policy perspective, it is going to be incredibly hard, whoever forms the next government, to fix public services. We did some analysis, and if you replicate the the time at which we improve public services most quickly, so looking at metrics like waiting lists and so on, even if you achieve that level of improvement, it would take 10 years to get services like courts, like schools, like hospitals, back to where they were in 2010. And that is an absolutely huge policy job. It's going to take money, yes, but it's also going to take really creative policy making and really effective implementation to turn around. That being said, I do think thinking about that plan for government, and that's how lots of people seem to be getting around the difficult politics of this pre-election. You know, we've heard very clearly today there is money in the system. It's just locked up in the bank accounts and houses of very wealthy people. And so what I would really hope is that more ambitious agenda can come to be with some of these policies, particularly on tax we've talked about today.
Good. I'm going to give you final words if you need any, if you want any, Liam.
I mean, not much more to say. I mean, this has been a great debate, and you know, the point about politics is that it is fueled by hope, and you know, there's an old definition of a pessimist. A pessimist is somebody who, faced with a choice of two evils, chooses both. And I'm an optimist. I mean, I genuinely think that change is possible. And when, you know, I gave this talk in Birmingham last week, and somebody said, oh, you know, I've come away a bit depressed. And I said, well, look, read the last chapter first, because the last chapter is about the future. And for me here, there are some traditions which the Labour Party in particular needs to resurrect and reclaim. You know, the Labour Party was founded as a party and a movement that believed in maximising freedom. But we're a we party. We believe that your agency, your options, your power are transformed by doing a few things together. That's a contrast to the Conservatives, who we would say are a me party. And so what the book tries to do is to say, look, the future could be extraordinary. The question is how we build a democracy of opportunity for those new possibilities, because the prize at stake is a new settlement for freedom, and that is the freedom to be you. In this extraordinary world that we're going to build, that is surely a prize worth debating and fighting for. Thank you.
Great stuff, Liam. Just before I give a final thanks, just look out for the next in the series from this Fairness Foundation and Policy Institute series. Also look out for the programme of work that we've been doing with Liam and John Penrose at the MPPG for Inclusive Growth on trying to understand the policy options and responses to this. We did a great programme last year of research, then a really useful conference in Parliament, and then sessions at the party conferences, and we're looking to keep that kind of model going, because we learn a lot from a really expert audience that comes to those, as we have done tonight. So just finally from me, just to say thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the team at the Policy Institute for putting this together. Thanks again to Will Snell and the Fairness Foundation for partnering with us in this series. Of course, thanks to our brilliant panellists, and finally to Liam, who's going to be at the back signing books very shortly for you, so do get one of those. Thank you, Liam.